Shocking, eh?
No, it's nice.
There's always hope. Um, shall we begin with a prayer?
Mm-hmm.
Gracious and loving God, here we are again on Thursday morning to look again at the stories that we, and in this case today, in the letters that have been written to teach us about the life of your son Jesus, and to help us along the way with the great exhortations to live well in our lives together. Give us wisdom and discernment as we read your word. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen.
Excellent. So, you guys just keep coming up with these excellent passages, which is really a great thing. And I'm so pleased to be doing it this way. I think it's really interesting to be doing it this way. It's kind of we're kind of hopscotching all over the Bible, aren't we? In a really interesting way, going from Isaiah to Luke and now to Romans. And each time I get a passage, it's a little bit of a surprise, because it's like, well, what are we going to do this week? And what can I possibly, what hay can I make while the sun shines? In this for this particular passage. And so I took the opportunity to just let this passage from Romans just jump us into a little discussion about Paul, because of course he's an extraordinarily important figure, and a little bit hard to pin down. And I'll use my time with my little presentation to discuss Paul a little bit, and then maybe that can then inform our discussions about the theological and the pastoral implications of this passage, because I think that those are really like you said, Vicky, when you introduced this passage, this passage is really interesting on those terms, on those theological and pastoral terms. So first a little bit about Paul, and then we'll get on to our discussion of the theology and the pastoral side of this passage. Oh, here's Judith. Wonderful. Just in time, Judith.
Sorry.
No problem at all. No problem at all. I just was telling everyone that I've used this passage as a excuse to kind of discuss Paul a little bit, because Paul is an interesting and obviously very influential figure. So we'll do that a bit, and then we'll get into the passage itself. Well, actually both. So let me see if I can find my handy dandy. No, of course it's not anywhere to be seen. Let me see. Here we go. Okay, there it is. Okay, great. Present. So let me see. Screen share. Present. I'm getting better at this, aren't I? There we go. Whoops. Well, just no sooner do I say that. Okay, I'm trying to make you a little bit bigger so I can see you guys. All right. So this is a mosaic of Paul, and I'm not sure exactly where it comes from, but it's really quite remarkable. Like when I had an opportunity a few years ago, luckily, to do a little tour of Italy with the Yale Divinity School when I was with them. And every time you see a depiction of Paul, he's pretty consistent. Like they were talking to each other, I think, about like what Paul looked like, because every time you see a depiction of Paul, he kind of looks a little bit like this. He's kind of this kind of funny looking guy, but and clearly someone who was a very a figure who was controversial from the very beginning. So let me see here. So this is roughly what I have planned again for today. Again, we'll look at the translations that Deb provided for us. Thank you, Deb. And I'm hoping, Deb, that you can help to point out any particular peculiarities or differences between the translations, because I looked them over, but I haven't totally done my homework there. And then we'll talk about Paul a bit, as I've said, and talk about the epistles themselves before we get into the theological and pastoral side. So this is basically screenshots of what Deb provided for us. And I'm really interested, Deb, that you picked the International Children's Bible as well. That was an interesting choice. But were there anything in particular that you wanted to point out to us about these different variations on the passage?
Nothing jumped out at me right away. And I think other than I actually clipped part of the message, because when I put the 12 verses 3 through 5, they gave me almost the whole
right
book, the whole they didn't give me just verses 3 through 5. They gave me 3 through like 10 or something like that. So and I think it's just the way they translate and do things. But the children's one, I just was curious about what a children's Bible would say about this. And this one, I thought I don't know anything about this particular version of the Bible, but I just thought it'd be interesting to see what a children's Bible would say about it and how it translated. So
yeah, I think it's really interesting too. I think I love, this is one of the beauties of kind of handing out, farming out this little part of the process, because you folks can, I think it's wonderful to like someone a while back chose one of the translations from like a Navajo translation, and I was like, wow, this is so interesting, right? It's like there are different all different possibilities on how to look at these translations, and one would suspect perhaps that for a children's Bible that they might try and simplify it, and it does seem to be perhaps a little bit simplified, but it's also pretty much contains the same meaning, I think, in a pretty good way.
yeah.
I like this, God has given me a special gift. I like that. How that's the difference between, for by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you not to think of yourself as more highly than you ought to think, is the Revised Standard. And this God has given me a special gift. It's a little bit different, but
I guess the thing that gets me in all of them, I think, well, in 3 of them anyway, is that the idea that God's assigned a certain amount of faith to you,
right,
which kind of bugs me.
yeah, a portion of faith, a measure of faith, yeah. an amount of faith, and then what's is the message different?
It's a little less clear.
Yeah,
Just basically the message says God gives it all to you.
yeah,
You didn't get any of it for yourself, but I'm not sure that I agree that, I mean, that when reading it, you can read it at one of that he's given you just a measure of faith, then the measure I got might be different from the measure that Sarah got or the measure that Mark got. And
right.
I don't, that kind of idea bothers me.
Yeah,
I mean, it's.
yeah, totally. All right, so there's that element of it is really is challenging in some ways. Absolutely.
Might I say, it might be we've all been given a large amount of faith, and it's what we take from it.
Huh.
We don't take 100%. A lot of them don't take 2%. They take, a very small amount of that faith that's given, that God has out there for you. So it can, like our mission, growing our faith. It's something that we can grow.
Right. Oh yeah.
No matter what he gives us, we can grow it.
Right.
So, I mean,
Right.
it's not like, oh, he only gave me this, I can't do anything with that, da 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 da. And I've got the same as Joe Schmo over there, who doesn't deserve any of it.
Yeah. Wow. That's really.
That's
fascinating. So for you, Brenda, built within this idea that that there's a portion of faith that's been given, that within that we can perhaps be given that portion, but we can grow.
growing our faith.
That can grow.
I mean, I went right to the mission statement that we have, and it's like, whoa. I don't like being only given so much, but I said, yeah, but we can grow it.
I like that. I like
Plant
that.
to grow.
This presents us immediately with some really interesting theological challenge. This idea of a portion of faith, a measure of faith. This was your choice, wasn't it, Vicki?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm listening and I'm getting a lot out of what you and others have contributed, but I have to say, and it might just be this whole frame of mind that I've been in for a little while, I can't fully get my head around some of the things that are said in these verses. I can't fully understand. In the part it says it's important that you not misinterpret yourselves as people who are bringing this goodness to God. No, God brings it all to you. I don't understand exactly what he's trying to say there.
So that was, which one was it that you were just reading from?
Oh, the Message.
The Message, yeah, that's what I thought. So it seems to me that the Message, one thing that we have to always be aware of with the Message, right, is that it's the work of an individual person. It's the work of Eugene Peterson, and who was a Lutheran minister in the Midwest. And I think personally, I really think highly of what Eugene Peterson has done to bring it into our kind of modern American language vernacular. But he's doing some interpretation here. I think it's pretty clear to me that that long paragraph that he's calling verse number 3, he's got quite a bit going on there.
Yeah.
And I personally, I kind of like it, but is it supported by the text is something worth debating a little bit.
If I could
please
add, when I read each of the 4, I thought that part of 4 to 6 of the Message would have been, should have been in the children's interpretation. I thought it was much more down to earth explaining.
Yeah.
So to me, but I totally agree with you, everything you just said about Eugene Peterson, because I'm a fan, but yes, he does interpret.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But I liked what he said at the end. I just think it was much clearer.
Yeah. Well, so it looks like in that passage that we have, it's ironic that it's talking about chopped off fingers and toes, because actually I think we should have chopped off that section of that passage in order to make it similar with the other ones. So it might be more accurate as a reflection with the others if it stopped at the word body.
Although I have to say, for my purpose,
Yeah.
for why I chose this, I was looking to find some verses about feelings of being inferior. The last sentence, let's just go ahead and be, and this is under the message, let's just go ahead and be what we were made to be without enviously or pridefully comparing ourselves with each other or trying to be something we aren't.
Yeah.
That is very different than how the verse starts out under the other versions. Don't think more highly of yourself than you should, and etc.
Right.
And that one is almost the opposite of the other. You know, you can be thinking too highly of yourself, or you can be thinking a lot less of yourself than you need to, because you're comparing yourself with others.
Right. Right. Absolutely. So it would be interesting to see what some of the other translations say in those other verses that have been chopped off. But I totally get your point, Vicky, and I think this passage is really kind of crucially important in terms of the individual and the community, right? Like, how do you think of yourself, and then how do you think of yourself within the community? So I think that's definitely what's at stake here, and I think it's possible to, I think it's up to us in some ways to discern whether this is a challenging message or a comforting message, or both. It probably is a little bit of both, as is usually the case with these things.
I've always liked this passage, like starting with verse 4, because I think later on some of the verses that go on in chapter 12, they talk about the different gifts that people have.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of the same thing. I've always found it comforting that, all right, well, maybe I can't be a someone that goes out, and it's not in me to go out and do this, but I know that I can do this.
Right.
I know that I can be a teacher. I can't.
Right.
I'm not necessarily that's going to go out and give, evangelize. That's not. I don't feel like that's my gift.
Right.
It's so I've always liked this, that I'm not the eye, but I definitely have a foot, that can do this, or I definitely have a hand that can do this. I can't draw, but I can knit. It's like that's, to me, it's very comfortable. It's comforting, and that we're still all equal, and you can't do that without, you can't go and do this unless these other parts are working.
Right.
So overall, I've thought this is a pretty comforting passage.
Yeah. Yeah. You were about to say something, Sarah?
Well, I was about to say that it doesn't really even say that we're all equal. I mean, we're all different, but what we have to contribute is what we are and need to recognize and contribute.
Mhm.
And then the extra layer of comfort for me is that together as a community, we are all one in community in Christ.
Mm.
And we belong to each other, so we need to love and care for each other.
Right.
Mhm.
Right. Yes, Liz.
It's the Romans is it's like motherly advice. You know, I think it's one of the best things about the letter to the Romans is that it seems very straightforward. It feels very straightforward,
Yeah.
and it's a validation for the whatever gift you can offer, you know,
Right.
because we are all part of one thing. We wouldn't be here if we weren't part of one thing. But you know, we're validated in the gifts that we can bring, and you know, that's like a gold star. It just feels good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Liz.
Yeah.
I like that
You're
too.
welcome, and you get a gold star every time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No
Yes.
doubt. Yeah. And, you
And
know,
as a community, we can't function successfully unless we have everybody using their gifts. If you don't have, you know, if you don't have someone that, well, I'm thinking right now I'm on the library board of trustees, and I am not good at going out and asking people for money. I'm not a fundraiser. I can account for the funds and pay the bills. I have the gift of bookkeeping and that kind of thing, and keeping people accountable, but I can't go out and ask people for money. And yet a successful library board needs to have people that are fundraisers. So, you know, a successful church needs to have people who are fundraisers. And, you know,
that reminds me, Deb, do you have that $100 that you were going to give?
you know, so I think that's what you're right. This is good motherly advice.
Yeah.
That, you know, you've got to recognize what your gift is. Your gift comes from God.
Yeah.
And you have to recognize that it comes from God, and then you have to use it in the community to create a stronger community.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's so cool, isn't it? That's such a great message.
And this message is, you know, part of the popular press, especially in the last year, with all the attention on introverts and extroverts and ambiverts, and the introverts are enjoying their place in the sun for a while.
Yeah, that's right. I was having a conversation with Mike Teich the other day, and you know, and I was, you know, and it was like, he was asking me about sermons and writing sermons and stuff, and I said, you know, like every time I sit down to write a sermon on a Saturday, I have no idea what's going to happen. You know, I have no, and like, I feel like, you know, I just jump in with this kind of this faith that something's going to happen, and usually something does happen, and I feel so incredibly privileged to be in a position where there are people who value me doing that. Like, I think that is just the most incredible thing. And because, you know, I feel like this is what I was, for whatever reason, this was what I was designed to do. Like, this is, and the fact that there's a community of people who are interested in it is just, to me, is a miracle. But that's the, you know, that's the thing, right? It's like finding that gift, finding what it is that you can contribute is so much part of how we find our meaning in our lives. Yeah, and this was really this reminds me of that Greek term eudaimonia, which is one that, that Aristotle used, which was this idea of human flourishing, right? Which is that like that we all, I think I mentioned it in the sermon not too long ago, but like, a can opener is intended to open a can. That's what its intention is. And we as humans are a little bit more complex than can openers. But that's our role, is to like find out what it is that really creates, that makes our souls flourish and makes our hearts full. And once we find that, that's really this gift that God, that Paul is talking about here. That that way of being the eye, or being the hand, or being the foot for the body of Christ. How I think we've jumped ahead a little bit, but that's good. So do you mind if I rein us in for a second and get us back to Paul for a second?
Sure.
So Paul, as you know, was some people say, there's this scholar N.T. Wright, who you may know, who basically, like, his thing is that he says that that Jesus was the founder of Christianity, but Jesus was not aware at all of being anything. But his feeling is that Jesus was interested in reforming Judaism, had no vision of creating a new religion, that it was really Paul who created Christianity and Christian theology. And if you look at this map, these are the three, I think they're 4 mission trips, or are they 3 mission trips, or they're the 3 mission trips, and then finally his trip to Rome at the end. This is pretty remarkable when you think about the fact that this is the 1st century, this is all taking place during antiquity, that he traveled this much, covered these huge, vast areas of the Mediterranean during that lifetime, and that he did this many mission trips, and that they were this involved. It's huge. He spent his life basically traveling on these mission trips. And I think that we can, scholars have patched this stuff together, both by looking at the book of Acts, and also by patching together evidence from the epistles. But Paul himself was a curious figure. He was kind of a little bit hard to pin down. He was clearly he was a Jew. He was Jewish. His original name was Saul, and then all of a sudden in Acts 13 it says, Acts 13:9, it says, oh, and he was also known as Paul. And then all of a sudden, from that moment on, he's called Paul. So he starts out as Saul, and then he becomes Paul. And he becomes Paul after this moment, which you're all familiar with, when he falls down off the horse and gets blinded by this vision of Christ. We know from evidence from the epistles that he was, that he wrote in Greek, and that he was born in Tarsus, and that Tarsus was kind of a cosmopolitan kind of center at that time, and that in that area he was able to be educated in Greek. So he was well educated in terms of rhetoric and writing. But he was also clearly very well educated in the Jewish scriptures, which and he describes himself as a Jew in 2 Corinthians here. 2 Corinthians 11:22. And on top of that, there's another occasion when he claims to be, he's in a trial in Jerusalem, and in order to get off of this trial in Jerusalem, he claims to be a Roman citizen. So he's got multiple things going on. He's educated in Greek. He's clearly Jewish, ethnically Jewish, but he also claims to be a Roman citizen, and there is also some evidence to suggest that he, that he might have been kind of person who we today might call, kind of black brown kind of person, in the sense that he was sometimes mistaken to be Egyptian. So there's kind of an interesting way in which Paul himself is kind of this culturally and ethnically kind of hard person to pin down. He was kind of the first transnational person in terms of in these terms, in terms of like the Christian religion. So in some ways he was a appropriate person to spread the word to shift, to be kind of the person who shifted Christianity away from being kind of like a reform of Judaism to being, a religion for the nations, for the Gentiles. So and this, we need to give credit where it's due. Paul is traditionally credited, I think my number here is wrong. It's not 14, it's 13. He's traditionally credited with 13 epistles, which is literally half of the New Testament is traditionally credited to Paul. And scholars say that they're pretty confident that 7 of them were definitely Paul, which would be 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, Philippians, Philemon, 1 and 2 Corinthians, and Romans. And that the other epistles that are traditionally associated with Paul, attributed to him, but are not, and these are scholars call Deutero-Pauline, are Hebrews, 2 Thessalonians, Colossians, Ephesians, Titus, and 1 and 2 Timothy. So I'm not sure if my numbers add up, but that's because I'm terrible at numbers. That's one gift that God did not give me.
Yeah, your numbers are right.
Oh,
You
okay.
get 7 and 7.
Oh, okay. But that's weird because I think that there are only, I don't know. Anyway. So I guess the question, I just wanted to say a few things about letters. So a letter obviously is, in terms of a genre, is a completely different thing from a gospel, right? A gospel is kind of in a way, it's kind of a form of biography. It's kind of a spiritual biography of a person, of Jesus in this case. And a gospel is, the good news, but a letter is something very, very, very different. And a letter has, if you think about it, a letter has all kinds of genre considerations, right? It has like, you open a letter and you recognize a letter immediately because it has a salutation, it has an introduction, it tends to have like a little, hi, how you doing paragraph, and then you kind of gets into the meat of the letter. And then at the end, it says, you know, yours sincerely or whatever. It has like really specific genre specifications, which allow us to recognize what a letter is and what the purpose of a letter is. These are very different considerations than what a gospel is. So a lot of the interpretations of the epistles are based on those genre specifications. You know, if you look at almost any whatchamacallit, what do you call it when you look at a book about the Gospels? Interpretation. Gosh, my brain has lost the word. Commentary. Thank you. Commentary. If you look at almost any commentary, that's the way of an epistle. That's the way it's laid out. It's like, oh, here's the salutation, and here's the this, and here's the this, and these different categories of the letter. But it's important for us also to remember that letters were a totally different thing in antiquity than they are today, right? You couldn't just slap a stamp on a letter, right? And you didn't have, like, you couldn't make photocopies of a letter. So the letters, in order for these letters to have had a life, think about it. It's amazing. They had to be copied and copied and copied by people, and they had to be, stowed in people's, luggage in the holds of ships that were being, rowed across the Mediterranean by slaves and stuff. It's just a totally different thing than what we think of as a letter. And to think that these letters had such an incredible life and were preserved over thousands of years, and how it could have entirely been possible that they could have been lost. But that, the faithful work of people to copy them and to distribute them kept them alive during those thousands of years. And then finally, the purpose. What is the purpose of these letters? I think that Liz said something really nice earlier on. This like, it's kind of a motherly advice. It really does get down to it, right? It's all about advice for the early church, because they didn't know, they had very little idea what they were doing. And Paul's coming along with these letters saying, here, consider this, consider doing this, consider seeing yourself in this way, or in this way, or, there's so much of the Pauline letters are advice in that way, because they just, they were struggling to figure out who they were and what it was all about, and who Jesus was, for heaven's sake. So now, now I think I've kind of finished with my little detour into Paul land, into the land of Paul. So I want to open it up again to see if that helped, if that made any of our observations about this passage any informed our observations at all about this passage. And I've put a few kind of bullet points here of things that kind of occur to me about this passage. And you folks have already picked up on a lot of other things, which I think are really interesting. You look like you're about to say something, Sarah.
Sorry about that. I was stifling a yawn.
Oh. I won't take it personally.
Please don't.
When you have the fourth bullet point there, Mark,
Ah,
an exhortation for early Christians versus a message to us. Well, he didn't realize, in my mind, he didn't realize that 2,000 years later would be, perhaps he didn't realize it would be talking about his letters.
yeah.
But how did you mean that? How do we look at that? It's also an exhortation for us, but oh, I don't know what I'm saying here. I can't get myself out properly. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Well,
Um,
I guess what I meant by that bullet point was like, you know, if you think about the purpose of a letter, like it has an immediate purpose. And in this case, the immediate purpose of that letter was to kind of give advice to the early Christians in Rome, saying, you know, don't think too highly of yourself. Think about yourself in this way. Um, and that's, you know, that has immediate relevance to that group of individuals who are the early Christians in Rome. But but how is it different for us, you know, after 2 millennia of you know, kind of the growing Christian tradition? Does it mean the same thing to us, or does it mean something different to us, or can we take it on? Do we listen to that advice in the same way as early Christians do? I guess that was what I was thinking about with that.
Well, it's something that we still 2,000 years later need the same advice.
Yeah.
Isn't it cool to think about people 2,000 years ago listening with the same sort of understanding that we're getting today?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that kind of, you know, kind of excites me about biblical literature, is that it transcends time in that way, in that, you know, because it appeals to human nature across time.
Right, we still need the same advice in a lot of ways that they needed back then.
Yeah.
After all this time.
Right.
We still need to be reminded of all
It
what's going on
provides
day
us
to
with
day.
a really wonderful, loving link to antiquity. I don't know. There's just something wonderful about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Also reassuring, because I was just thinking about my grandsons, whom I saw recently, and how different their world is from mine. And yet our world is so different from when these letters were written. And yet we hear that message in the same way.
Mhm.
So perhaps the people who are coming behind us, like our grandchildren, will live in a different world, but still need the same sorts of thoughts. What do I want to say? Moral guidance?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Spiritual support?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Imagine him writing something way back then that could stand the test of time and be used by generations and generations and generations later. That's
Yeah.
just amazing.
It is remarkable. I remember listening to a series of lectures about political theory, and that sounds pretty dry to say it that way, but like, you know, it started with Socrates, and it went on to just all these, you know, to Plato, and then to Machiavelli, and then to, you know, this character and this character, Voltaire, and all these different people. And all these different people were all struggling with the same questions all the way through, you know, and they all had totally, like, many of them had totally different ideas about how these particular things worked, but they were all struggling with the same ideas, and they were all working off of each other too. It was like one grand conversation that moved across time. And the same thing I think is true here, right? Is that you can definitely see like this long progression of speculation that really begins with Paul, Christian theology is often thought of as kind of beginning with Paul, and then kind of grows and moves from there. And you know, and Paul he was kind of an irascible character too. Like, he said some really bad things about women in particular. He was like, no women should speak in the church, and stuff like that. And so he's not universally loved, Paul, but he's definitely a very interesting fellow, no doubt about it. And he says some very interesting things. Most of the feminist biblical scholars break out in hives when you start talking about Paul.
He was a product of his time.
Yes.
You know, I mean,
And maybe his culture too.
and his culture. Yeah.
Especially if
definitely.
he's from more of a even, Tarsus, I think, is like Syria, or, a more
Mhm.
Eastern community that, even today has much more conservative ideas about the role of women. So I have to say, something you said earlier, Mark, kind of set my imagination going when you said that these are the, how marvelous that these letters have survived, considering all the and I'm thinking about, what about the letters that didn't survive? What was in
My
them?
mind went there too.
Mm.
Mhm.
Yeah, can you imagine if, like,
Mhm.
we find some shipwreck somewhere that has a some kind of
Yeah.
vessel that has some letters in it or something.
Right.
Yeah,
My.
and that kind of tying into what he has said about women, there's that whole thing about how, was it Peter that came to understand that you didn't have to follow the kosher laws, that the
Mhm.
food was there. Maybe Paul had a similar breakthrough at some point that
Right. Mhm.
that we don't have anymore about the role of women.
Mhm.
Well, that would be
Certainly,
nice.
because certainly women were were very much part of Jesus's ministry.
Yeah.
So
And there's that whole thing in the Easter story about how women were the ones who came to the tomb,
Yeah.
right? It's like
exactly.
those that played the crucial role.
Right.
And even in the early church, before Paul got super involved, I mean, there were a lot of women that were instrumental in sharing their homes and their, the message, and, the forgotten women of the Bible.
Yeah. Yeah. My mentor from my first theology degree is who really was the woman who really inspired me to study a lot of this. Her name was Phyllis Tribble, and she was a really powerful, and she was actually very instrumental in she wrote all of my recommendations for all the graduate schools that I went to and everything. But
really?
she's wonderful. I think she must have passed away recently, because my cards get returned from her.
What was the book she wrote? We watched that series for a Lenten program once about every 500 years you have a yard sale. The different ways of the different churches. You had the Reformation, and
Yeah.
what was that book? It was her last book, I think.
Well, there's two Phyllises. There's Phyllis Tribble and there's Phyllis Tickle, and I don't know if
I'm sorry.
yeah,
Excuse
and
me.
I think you might be thinking
Tickle.
about Tickle.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is kind of
Which
fun.
is a lot different.
Yeah.
A
But
lot.
anyway, that was her Tribble, my mentors. Her entire career was kind of based on this notion of trying to, like, find the evidence of the legacy of women's influence in the Bible. So she did wonderful work. But I want to hear about this 500-year yard sale. That sounds good. Yeah. I think we might be due for another one. Was that her thesis?
Yes, yes. Oh, gosh. I don't think I still have the book, but I'll look it up.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
Maybe we can have a 500-year yard sale at the church.
I just heard Fitzwilliam's having one Saturday.
Yes. Well, no, it's Ackworth, not Fitzwilliam.
Yes.
Well,
Well, maybe
maybe
Fitzwilliam is as well.
Oh, maybe.
Fitzwilliam is
They
on
both
the
may.
10th.
Oh, okay.
Ackworth is on the 17th, maybe.
Ackworth is 17th.
Yeah.
Um,
Fitzwilliam. I went last year. I happened upon it. It was a fun thing. It was out on the lawn.
yeah. So before we get to the end of here, I wanted to talk about this or throw this out for all of us. This idea of kind of like this first bullet point here about the kind of the rights of the individual and the good of the community, because I think that let me just stop the share so that we can be together a little bit more. The good of the rights of the individual versus the good of the community is that tension, right? Is a tension that goes all through being a human being, right? Like all political theory and all religion and like all those, all just concerned with this tension between the good of the community on one hand and the rights of the individual on the other. And I think that this text is a really interesting one in that way. And it's also really timely for us right now with COVID, right? Because one of the things that COVID has really shown us in this country is that we really, in this country, our culture really, really, really emphasizes the rights of the individual. And as a result of that, we're kind of in trouble, right? And this passage is really interesting in that way because it says, look, we're not all equal. We have different measures, but we're all incredibly important, and we have to work together, right? And we're all part of the same body of Christ. Not just anybody, but the body of Christ, right? The body of salvation, which is really profound, really, when you, I think. Because it shows that yeah, we're all different, but we're all in this together, and which is a phrase we've heard a lot during COVID. We're all in this together, and we have to recognize that kind of symbiosis, cooperation, is at the core of our faith, which is really powerful, I think. And it's something that we just naturally do so well in our church. We're so good at this, at being a community, at having the food pantry and doing our services and doing good things in service, not only of ourselves, but in what Brenda was saying, growing our faith. So Vicky, I think I'm so glad you chose this passage, and I do think it is a source of profound comfort for us, even though it comes from Paul, who's a weird guy. Weird and wonderful.
Yeah, what a message for Easter people that we are. I mean, it fell right in. When I read it, it was like, oh, this is an Easter message. Going out, doing and joining and showing what you have and finding another like you or whatever, it was so positive for me. I liked the message. It was not a negative at all.
Yeah. Cool.
Mhm.
Nice. Mary Lou, from your theological education, do you have anything to add about Paul's weirdness?
She's muted.
Mhm.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I had probably the other half of Phyllis Tribble, who was Carol Fontaine,
Uh-huh.
and she was definitely well, I shouldn't say is still a feminist.
Yeah.
And she would look at the different things. And also C. Car Wan, who taught New Testament, one of the things he said was, what if you had a bunch of your letters after you died all gathered up and somebody was going to put it in a book and call it scripture? What would it look like? Paul didn't intend that to happen.
Huh.
It was just a momentary sending to a certain group of people. So it's amazing that it did make it to us. But Paul was also very boastful.
Yeah.
He always had to say, like, I wasn't a disciple, but look, I became, and I'm doing so much, and look at what I've done.
Yeah.
So that's something else. I have issues with Paul, and not just feminist kind of things, but you have to look at what he said, just like women not speaking in the church.
Uh-huh.
At the time that he wrote that, women were talking in the church and causing trouble because they were asking the question, all those questions.
Nevertheless, she persisted.
Yeah.
And men didn't want to hear it. And, Paul was against sex. So that took your mind off of following Jesus.
Right.
And there's so many different things that he said. You have to really look into the context.
Yes.
And not just take it. I wouldn't be reverend if I listened to Paul.
Yeah. Yeah. And yet he has a lot of really interesting things to say. Yeah.
He did.
Yeah. No doubt.
You really have to dig into Paul. It's not face value for anything.
Well, and we'll have more opportunities to, no doubt, because since Paul, is such an important figure, we'll have more opportunities to talk about him in the future. But this is at least a kind of a primer for about him, and I just wanted to make sure that the other person who has a MDiv doesn't didn't think that I'm completely off track.
No, we came from two different lines of thought, which are now together, which is really, I think that's a great combination of Andover, Newton, and Yale.
Yeah.
I really.
They're now
there
one
yet.
institution. Yeah.
But I think it's a great combination.
All right. Well, I have I actually stupidly scheduled a meeting with a student at noon. I told her that I would be a few minutes late, but I just wanted to unfortunately say that I can't hang out longer here.
So be it.
Yeah. But thank you again for a wonderful, incredibly interesting session, Bible study. And looks like Judith
Judith is waving.
Yeah, I gotta go too.
Me
Yes.
too.
Me too.
Okay.
Thank you,
Stay
Mark.
safe.
Thank
All right.
you. So
Bye-bye.
Mark,
Mark.
Bye.
Mark,
Yes.
I'm gonna send you an email about the coffee cocktail hour stuff.
Oh, okay.
Okay,
All right.
bye.
Bye.